So you're very welcome to our next panel on Irish neutrality and the Triple Lock. Niamh Ní Bhriain, Rory and Finn are going to bring us through what's happening. So go míle maigad.
Míle buíochas as an gcuireadh a bheith páirteach í Scoil Gheimhridh í Chadhain seo an 3 uair atá muid i mbail first agus tá sé an deas a bheith seo arís live thosamuid an Neutrality Roadshow an bhliain seo caite I mí meitheamh I gunda cirí agus chaistil muid ar fud na tíre ag leabhar faoi nóideach na hÉireann agus an glas tíreach. Is é an stad seo, an stad don Roadshow iver 16 agus tá muid an sásta bheith an seo arís. Leabhar muid faoi nóideach na hÉireann agus an tábhacht atá ag bhaint leis I gcúirsaí náisiúnta agus idirnáisiúnta. Thosaigh Fionn agus ina dhí sin le Rory agus tar éis sin le Mary. So, Fionn.
Hi, my name is Fionn Wallace. My background is working in Dáil Éireann from 2012 to 2019 and then went over to the European Parliament from 2019 to 2024. And I worked on foreign affairs committees and security and defence committees over there. I want to talk about, you have to excuse me for reading a bit. This is a bit rush pulling this together between work and everything. But I want to talk about how global events are playing a role in building consensus for building the Triple Lock and with it neutrality. And briefly comment where neutrality would fit in the context of a 32-county republic. And I want to expand on something that we have talked about extensively over the course of the roadshow, and that is the state of play with NATO and US-led imperialism, which is all over the news at the moment. I mean, have you noticed this? Like these stories, these opinion pieces and editorials talking about the end of the transatlantic alliance. So you have these headlines like "From Guarantee to Risk: How Trump Has Changed Europe's Relationship with NATO," opines Colin Sheridan in The Examiner. US intentions towards Greenland threaten NATO's future, but European countries are not helpless, we are told by Chatham House. NATO without America, Europe thinks the unthinkable, is the big read in the Financial Times this week. Could Trump pull the US out of NATO, and what would happen if he did, writes MI6 stenographer Luke Harding in The Guardian 8 years ago. The thing is, we've been here before, and this is at least the third time there's been this notable propaganda blitz with this narrative. So the first was in May 2017, after Trump came to Brussels, meeting many EU leaders for the first time. So he said 8 NATO allies must stop freeloading and increase their military spending, basically double their military spending to 2% of GDP. The EU responded with talk about strategic autonomy and being capable of going it alone. The rhetoric at the time was all about Trump, Putin, Erdogan and Brexit, giving the EU a wake-up call about the need to increase military spending. Trump was supposedly distancing the US from the long-standing transatlantic cooperation as a result of his America First policy. And this was the backdrop, this narrative was the backdrop to the Permanent Structured Cooperation Agreement, or PESCO, which is perhaps the most significant stepping stone on the road to an EU, apart from the Lisbon Treaty obviously, the most significant stepping stone to an EU army and runaway military expenditure at the EU level. A European Defence Fund was established, joint funding of battle groups aimed at integrating European armies, joint procurement of weapons, and a host of other initiatives were cooked up. There was an EU-NATO summit in December. Basically, it was all sorted in record time, and then in December in 2017, there was an EU-NATO summit where there was all smiles and celebrations all around. And it was talked about in the kind of like think tank global European, field at the time, in the spirit of rapprochement between the US, NATO and the EU. And apparently, all it took to repair this supposed rift was for the EU to turn itself into a fully fledged military union, just like Trump had asked. So EU military spending in the decade leading up to 2016 had flatlined around the €150 billion mark. So Trump comes to Brussels, makes his criticism, and the curve takes off. So by the end of 2024, we were up to 326 billion, or precisely 1.9% of the EU GDP, exactly where Trump wanted, just in time for Trump and the Republicans to come back and say, okay, let's go to 5%. And again, we're presented with this saying Trump is unreliable narrative. Look at how he is with Putin, screwing over Ukraine. Yet in reality, the boss of NATO has said, he's given the orders, and the EU has responded, yes, sir, how high, sir. This is the backdrop, again, to this massive drive to militarization coming from the European Commission. In March last year, they presented the Rearm Europe package, which aims to get EU military spending up to 3.5% of GDP, or around 680 billion euros per year by 2030. Another 1.5% of GDP rise in spending will go towards kind of general military-related expenditure, military mobility, and so on, all the infrastructure, railroads, bridges, to get the new weapons we're going to buy to the front, wherever that is. And this is Trump's 5% demand being put into motion. A massive recruitment drive is underway, and according to Commission documents, the goal is to increase standing armies across the EU by an additional 800,000 troops in the next 3 to 4 years. Germany has just reintroduced conscription, something we were pointing to as a grim possibility at the start of the Neutrality Roadshow. The Commission is ensuring that by 2030, the EU will be spending 970 billion euros a year on war preparation. That is more than half what the entire EU bloc spends on healthcare at the moment. The Trump is untrustworthy, NATO is in big trouble narrative has only served one function: to build consensus for colossal military spending among US allies, which is precisely what Trump and his team want. This is what US imperialism needs right now. That the pundit class and politicians are genuinely surprised by US actions and pronouncements at the moment is difficult to take seriously. Elbridge Colby, Trump's pick for Undersecretary for War Policy, has been telegraphing the new imperialist division of Labour for some time now. The recently published National Defence Policy is basically a crystallisation of stuff that he's been saying since at least 2021. And according to Colby, and now official US policy, the US must admit its limitations, focus its energies on the real challenge to its global supremacy, the People's Republic of China. It must push like-minded allies to build their military capacities in order to take responsibility for their spheres of interests. Collectively, the US and its allies will build strength to deter China. The 2026 defense strategy is explicit. Speaking of their allies, it says the US will, quote, incentivize and enable them to step up. This requires a change in tone and style from the past, unquote. They will push allies around the world to meet the 5% military spending targets, and as their, quote, allies do so, together with the United States, they will be able to field the forces required to deter and defeat potential adversaries in every key region of the world, unquote. It says that it will, quote, be strong but not unnecessarily confrontational, unquote, with China. Yet they openly talk about a strategy of deterrence by denial that will see China's naval activity and possibly trade interfered with from Japan to Malaysia. They want to, quote, set the military conditions required to achieve a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific that allows all of us to enjoy a decent peace, unquote. They're talking about maintaining at least a 3-to-1 military advantage over China in China's part of the world. This is a recipe for proxy wars and eventual direct confrontation with China. NATO and the EU are essential to this plan, and everyone, including Ireland, is increasing their military spend as requested. If there's any doubt about the attitude of the EU towards NATO, we need look no further than the annual EU Common Security and Defence Policy report that was adopted by the European Parliament 10 days ago. It reads, stresses that NATO remains a crucial component of collective transatlantic territorial defence, and that the EU and NATO play complementary and mutually reinforcing roles in enhancing international security. Calls furthermore on European allies in NATO to take swift and concrete actions in order to build a strong and credible European pillar of the alliance. And we can look at which private hands this massive transfer of public wealth is going to. Take Germany, for example. They're going to spend 600 billion euros on weapons between now and 2029. Many of the mega projects that will eat up this money have not even started, but a heap of the ones that have are with US owned arms companies. So a projected 15 billion for F-35 fighter jets, a complete waste of money, a fighter jet that doesn't do what it says on the tin. 7.2 billion for the 60 Chinook transport helicopters payable to US's Boeing. The acquisition of 720 PAC-3 surface-to-air missiles, also from Lockheed Martin, is planned at 5.3 billion, and the list goes on. The integration of the US in EU military structures is also massive. Collaboration of military manufacturing is the norm, and US military bases are everywhere, and there are hundreds of US nuclear weapons planted all around the continent. The EU and NATO and the US are all fused at the hip, and everyone is getting ready for World War III or IV, whatever the count is at the moment. This, of all moments, is when the Irish Comprador political elite have decided to ditch the triple lock, step away from the UN Charter Order, and open up the possibility to send unlimited numbers of our sons and daughters to join illegal EU and NATO-led war-fighting missions. This is precisely what the Defence Amendment Bill 2025 allows for in the small print. It just leaves the door wide open for direct NATO collaboration and EU-led wars. And this is when the Trump narrative has come back for the third time. I said earlier that all it has done is serve to increase military spending among US allies, but now it seems it's going to be it's being repurposed to undermine the concept of neutrality itself. The Let's Ditch the Triple Lock editorial from our paper of record in the 26 counties, the Irish Times, this week included the following as a supporting argument for getting rid of the triple lock. Quote, yet the escalating NATO crisis and ominous signs that the transatlantic security order protecting Europe for 80 years may be ending means Ireland faces profound new questions. Chief among these is the country's commitment to its own defence within a broader European network. The fact of the matter is that in the US, NATO, EU vision, there is no place for neutral states. It's embarrassing for them to be this gung-ho and psychotically enthusiastic for war and war machinery when some countries can just choose to opt out. Also, 5% of GDP in a tax haven is nothing to sniff at. The problem is the people who crafted a disciplined opting out for Ireland, from Wolfe Tone to James Connolly, even to De Valera, are all long gone. And all those who have come in their wake have been chipping away at it to the point where it takes a bit of argument to put forward the notion that we are in any way neutral at all. Think of Shannon and our behaviour around everything to do with the genocide. The triple lock, which has been in place since 1960, is an embarrassment for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael politicians who have done everything in their power to make Ireland a great little country to do business in. If you're looking for a sacrifice zone for cattle monoculture, experimental tax regimes, data censor resource drains, foreign investment funds mining people for rent, and a NATO-forward military airbase, why wouldn't we sign up to expand NATO military bases and weapons testing and offer up our children as cannon fodder for imperialist wars? The vote on the triple lock is happening in the coming weeks in the Dáil, and the media onslaught is intense, repeating all the lies that spurred us on to start the Neutrality Roadshow in the first place. This is, to my mind, setting the stage for a repeat of the two shameful votes to maintain the central bank as the issuing bank for Israeli war bonds during a genocide. They're scared of the people. That's why they're not putting this back to a referendum and orchestrating a massive disinformation campaign about what they're up to. They know that they would lose if it was put to the people. Even though there has been, with all the propaganda they have been putting out, there has been a movement of the Dáil kind of in favour of, getting rid of the triple lock. It would be very difficult to claw this back if it goes, and we will be one step closer to a 32-county republic that is a fully blown NATO outpost run by a political class that will always put the interests of foreign capital before sovereignty or the interests of their people. Unless we have a communist revolution, of course. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay. Just to one of the points I was going to make in here, but just maybe say it now to join on from what Fionn was saying. I think it's very important that we understand and kind of pull back from this kind of this split in NATO, split in the West. What we're seeing is a disciplining of Europe and the EU and Britain by the US, not a rupture between the US and Europe. And US imperial policy is explicitly now seeking to undermine the United Nations and international law and recenter global order on the rules of the United States. Now, there's a good argument to say that the United Nations systems and our multilateral institutions and international law have always been, at least in part, to support the interests, have been set up that way to support the interests of Western dominance. But they have allowed a certain degree of universality and so on, and capacity to push back against that, to the extent now that the United States and leading Western powers in Europe and Britain want to jettison it altogether, despite claims that from the Europeans, at least, that they want to maintain it. And I think we need to understand the Irish government in the 26 counties, their attempt to scrap the triple lock as being part and parcel of this attempt of the West to withdraw from the United Nations and international law that we've seen with the behaviour in the genocide, and more recently with the United States in Venezuela and threats to Greenland. So I think it's important, because we're constantly given this film saying this idea that the main narrative is that, everything's changing, there's flux, Europe and the US are splitting, the world order as we've known it for 80 years is in a moment of rupture, as Mark Carney said. This is a bit of a ruse, and I think it's there's a shift going on, as Fionn outlined, within US dominated Western imperialism, and Europe and Britain are having to and Ireland are shifting their position within that, but they're not departing from it. There's not this kind of split that's going to fall apart. So what I'm going to talk about then, the rest of this is kind of more about the kind of British-Irish angle and the interest or the relationship between neutrality of the southern state with the north of Ireland. Now, we've seen, as part of this kind of media blitz from the commentators and also in political discourse from politicians, from state figures and reports, increasing interest in Irish neutrality and, more broadly, rather, Ireland's defence and security arrangements from what we might call the British establishment. And this was really, really apparent, like almost to a comical extent, the week after Catherine Connolly's election in November of last year. And at that time, there was a House of Lords meeting of the kind of Standing Committee on Security and Defence, which was called by two lords in the House of Lords, one of them being Sir Jock Stirrup, amazingly called, who was the former head of the British Army, and the other being Sir Lord Paul Bew, who I'll come back to. Some of you may know Paul Bew, Professor Emeritus of Politics and History in Queen's University, Belfast. And at that House of Lords meeting, former British military and NATO commander, Rear Admiral Chris Parry, gave a really chauvinistic presentation saying that basically Ireland needed to, pull up its socks, get with the modern world, and become part of kind of Western military alliance for the good of Britain. It wasn't about the good of Ireland, it was for the good of Britain. And he was invited on RTE to talk about this. This was reported in the Irish Times. He was invited on RTE. It was the morning radio show, which was at the time run by Claire Byrne. She's since left. And he had basically 20 minutes to pontificate about his thesis. And one of the things she said at the end was that, now, Chris, you said that one of the things that would be great potential here for Ireland is great things to contribute to a military alliance and to NATO. And he said, yes, that's because the Irish are great fighters. And she was like, what? And he was like, it's just in the character, isn't it? You look at history, it's in the character of the Irish. So, really, Irish can really add something to this. It'd be great to have you on board, And this is unchallenged. This is like RTE smoothing this type of discourse, right? And likewise, Jock Stirrup, who's in the House of Lords, former head of the British Army, saying that Catherine Connolly, or he didn't say it directly, he said recent changes, this the days after her election, recent changes in the Irish political system and leadership are a threat to Britain and to NATO, right? So there's a degree where there's a very clear, explicit communication from the British state and the military apparatus and its relationship to the political establishment that Ireland needs to change its security arrangements. there's all these claims about Ireland being exposed flank to Europe, to Britain being the weakest link in European security, that the Irish or the 26 counties are freeloading off a British expenditure. Why are the why are the British public having to pay for the security of Ireland, right? But again, their concern is not about security of Ireland, it's all the security of Britain and Europe. So the central claim that we see here is that, or that's being made, is that Irish neutrality is no longer viable for British security. And this, of course, all this kind of discourse that's coming out and reports and so on from think tanks and commentators, all this is happening whilst two things are happening between the Dublin and London governments. One is that a new military defence pact is being drawn up. Now, there is an existing defence and security pact, particularly around kind of the use of the British Air Force to protect Irish assets when they're under threat. And this is a gentleman's agreement which has never been made public, although it's widely known about. So this is being formalised and will be written down, be published. It was expected to be out already, but it has not appeared. I suspect that will appear before the Irish state in the south takes over the EU presidency in June, right? So this is coming, a new defence pact. The other thing that's happening, which are talked about in the media completely separately, is that the Dublin and London governments are basically trying to develop a new piece of legislative framework for dealing with legacy cases, referring to the conflict here, right? And this has been they presented their initial plans for this recently, and there was a lot of criticism of it. They've kind of gone back to the drawing board. Okay, that the public didn't like that. That's reformulated, and you can only imagine the discussions that are happening between the Dublin and London governments and the horse trading that's going on over how to deal with legacy cases here. That this is being bound up into this. I think what we can see from all these kind of changes is that the Downing Street Declaration is dead. And Britain very much does have a selfish strategic interests in the north of Ireland. And that is maybe was never the case that was not the case. But this is certainly being kind of re-centred in British security and military thinking. So Britain, as part of this broader EU militarisation, which Fionn touched on, and I think Niamh is going to talk about more, so Britain, as part of this kind of European militarisation, obviously is no longer part of the EU, but it has its own rearmament plans, as I'm sure people here are well aware. They released the new defence strategy in May of last year. And around that same time, Stammer announced these kind of rearmament plans. And he specifically mentioned, the only specific place that he mentioned in his speech announcing that was the Thales factory in Belfast. And this was going to be great bonanza. We used to talk about the peace dividend. Ironically, the Raytheon factory in Derry was considered to be part of the peace dividend of the peace agreement. Now we're just talking about the war dividend and this is part of a desperation of the British state and the Labour Party to have a kind of military Keynesianism where state investment will grow into the arms industry, and that will provide growth, this elusive growth for the British economy more broadly. And really what we're seeing is the subject of decades and decades of underinvestment from the British state all across regions and communities across British-controlled territories, let's say. And there's a huge effort of the Assembly here, as well as Invest NI, the public body trying to bring investment into the north, to work and expand the amount of military contracts here. And Thales are, of course, they're expanding their production systems. They now have 3 sites in Belfast, and there's, I think, another one being developed elsewhere. They're the principal beneficiaries of this. And there's even talk, amazingly, from Invest NI that there will be trickle down into smaller indigenous arms companies and security companies from investments in Thales. And interestingly, the government in the south, the Dublin government, have at least 2 contracts now being signed with Thales for subsea security things and so on. So the beneficiaries of Invest NI and the British government investing to trying to make more Thales investment into Northern Ireland, whilst the government in the south is militarising by buying Thales products and having contracts. So also what we see is at the time of the British rearmament plan and the EU rearmament plan that Niamh's going to talk about around kind of April, May last year, also emerging a new UK-EU defence security agreement, which sought to kind of build closer alliance and cooperation in between not only their militaries, but their economies and their industrial planning in light of the changed geopolitical context. So, I mean, I kind of joke this is via backdoor getting Brexit undone. And basically this is like trying to join the two economies and regularize them to the point of almost Brexit not existing or not having happened behind the scenes, right? And it being led by an idea of economic growth, which is driven by military spending. And of course, the British government want to access the 800 billion euros that has been released for the EU militarisation plan, the rearmament plan. And the EU likewise wants to have access to the British arms industry, which is the second biggest in Europe after Germany. So it's mutually of economic interest for both to try and do this. So as Fiona's outlined, what we're kind of seeing, rather than this kind of rupture between Europe and the US within NATO, is the kind of herding of Europe like sheep by the US within NATO. So what does this mean then for the question of unification? And Fiona's touched on this. So there's quite a history since after the Second World War of a kind of transactional approach between the 26 counties government, the British state and the US around unification and NATO, a kind of trading of like, well, we'll join NATO if there's unification. And in 1948, the US approached 1949, asked Ireland to join NATO. Would Ireland be interested to join NATO? And the Irish government said, yes, we'd love to join NATO, but the cost of it will be getting rid of partition and the unification of Ireland. So the US said to the British, the Irish are interested in joining, but this is the cost of it. The British said, go fuck themselves, obviously, and that didn't happen. This came back periodically, has returned in the 1960s, the late 1960s. Charles Haughey was foreign minister, and he attempted to make a secret agreement between the British, the Dublin, London governments that Irish ports and airports would be opened to NATO use if there was a agreement made that there would be a timeline for unification. Again, the British kind of declined this, not on the basis they thought it was a bad deal, but on the basis that Charles Haughey did not have permission from the Taoiseach of the time to have this negotiation, which was in fact true. And of course, we've got to the point where essentially that is the agreement that's being made. It's being kind of, well, Shannon Airport is in effect part of the logistic hubs of the US military, and there's NATO ships in Irish ports non-stop, as some, our friends in anti-imperialist action are keen to spot those things. This is kind of happening, and what's happened to the unification, okay, there is now a kind of a democratic process still to be triggered by the British Secretary of State to allow for there to be some process where unification may be possible within the Good Friday Agreement. So we're seeing, arguably today, a return to this kind of transactional relationship between unification and NATOification in the context of these kind of contemporary geopolitics. And I think there's three kind of basic models that we can foresee that would be ways in which NATO and unification can be bound up together. And one is to have unification outside NATO, or if it's not NATO, we're also talking about something which is in effect NATO, but is perhaps not called NATO. Like a neutral 32-county republic, which is not part of this Western military alliance. A second version, which is a federated version of a United Ireland of some sort, where there's a kind of security partition, where there's some form of kind of collective government, but these kind of two regions or statelets remain kind of separated around security. I think that's highly unlikely. And then the third one, which seems all but inevitable unless we're very well organised, is unification within NATO, or something that's tantamount to being NATO. And the forces are aligning for this. We can see, for example, Fine Gael in the south, one of the most right-wing of our leading right-wing parties, trying to position itself as a party of national unity, with Leo Varadkar never out of this place up giving talks about how important the unification is to Fine Gael and the future of Ireland. And like to kind of joke, it's like the blue shirt putting on the green jersey. Varadkar is a very unlikely character to be up here making this campaign, but he's been doing it to very receptive audiences, including many cross-community and unionist organisations. And there's also a very strong part of the unionist kind of political tradition, at least in the Second World War, since the Second War, which is a kind of trenchant form of unionist Atlanticism. And it's, often it's easy to think that to not think of the unionist political tradition as something which has its own forms of kind of political thinking, intellectual work, but there's quite a bit of this kind of unionist Atlanticism. And I mentioned Paul Bew earlier, so former professor of politics and history at Queen's University, is now a Lord in the House of Lords, as I mentioned, part of the Security and Defence committee there. He's a founding member of the Henry Jackson Society, which is named after a prominent American neoconservative kind of bureaucrat. He founded that along with David Trimble and Tim Collins, who some of you may remember, whatever he was, General Tim Collins, the man who apparently had a necklace of teeth in Iraq, in the British military. And Paul Bew's son, John Bew, who many of you may be aware of, Belfast born, has been the chief national security advisor to the British government over the last, how many was it, 4 or 5 British Tory prime ministers, and now under Keir Starmer. And he has been the developer of the last 2, the principal author of the last 2 British defence strategic reviews and so on, right? So there, and he's also a founding member of the Henry Jackson Society. So there's a father and son team from Belfast who are both kind of unionist, trenchant, neoconservative Atlantists at the heart of the intellectual work in the British state of trying to understand and reorient Britain within this kind of changed geopolitical situation, but specifically trying to see how Britain can maintain its privileged position, a special relationship supposedly, within a kind of a world order led under US imperialism. And of course we have the DUP making repeated complaints about Irish neutrality, and that it's, you know, not pulling up their socks and leaving Britain and the North undefended. And we can see this kind of insidious kind of slow creep that these things have, not just within the context of the British state, the British media and the House of Lords and so on, but they kind of leak into quite more subtle things. So I'm an academic, I work in Trinity College, Dublin in the south, and I was dismayed recently to find out that Paul Johnson, the former British ambassador to Dublin, is now the president or the director, I can't remember exactly the title, of the Irish Universities Association. So the Irish Universities Association is a kind of body made up of all the higher education bodies in the Republic, which they lobby the government, and they set pay agreements also with the academic staffs in relation with the unions and the government and so on. So they're quite an influential body. So why would the British ambassador, and he announced recently when he was going to stand down, he stood down a bit early from his ambassadorship and said he and his wife, he's Scottish, she's English, they love Ireland, they just love Ireland, it's great and they're going to stay. And everyone was like, oh, isn't that wonderful, we're so great in Ireland, we even made the British, he kind of almost stayed with us now. And I'm like, hold on a second, what's going on with this? So I looked up, well, who is this man who has no experience in the third level education sector? He's got no experience of being anything. We've told that he's a career diplomat, so why is a diplomat doing this? So what did he do before he was the British ambassador? His previous post was the British permanent representative to the European Union's Security and Defence Agreement. That was post-Brexit. Then he spent almost 10 years as the Britain's representative to NATO. And then before that in Sweden, which of course is now has joined NATO. And he started out in the Department of Defence. So this guy is a career securocrat, been representing the interests, military interests, not just the kind of civilian diplomatic interests of the British state, who's now embedded in a leading position within the Irish university sector. So why would that be? Well, we think about the militarisation of research funds that's happening both within British education system, increasingly within the Irish education system, but certainly within the European Union system, where the principal, it's the largest academic research fund in the world, is the European Union's Horizon programme, which has been both massively expanded for the next 5 years, it's almost doubled, but they're also opening it to dual use, meaning that military technologies can now receive funding, including work with industry and universities. So obviously Paul Johnson, it seems to me, is put into university system to direct it, to steer this process and to protect British interests in the militarisation, not just of Irish research funding, but of European Union and access those funds and so on. We might think as well from an example from here of St Dominic's School, not far away from here, where there was a recent attempt of Thales, the French arms company that has factories in Belfast, to do a kind of arms corporation PR within the school to talk to students. Of course, part of a kind of normalisation of the military industrial complex within the school system, and also a kind of idea of a kind of, I don't know what to call it, like aspiration washing. You can have a great career in defence and the arms industry, and targeting that at working class nationalist and Republican communities as part of this kind of armed austerity, that growth will happen through militarization. And when you're looking for a future career, girls, why not work for Thales? This is a great place. Woman in STEM, it's fantastic. Let's get women involved in military science. There was a protest against this, and that meeting was called off. The school said, well, we didn't invite them. You're like, okay, you didn't invite them, but they asked, can we come? And you said yes. Right. So, and I mean, I cite these two examples as this kind of because we're zooming down from this huge macro level geopolitical stuff into the really insidious way that the militarization creep comes into our institution, into our education system, into our economic planning, and on both sides of the border, in order to try and create this normalization of militarization as a key part of our society, and in fact, indeed something that we should welcome, because it allows us to kind of grow our economies. I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
I'm going to speak a bit more about neutrality. I'm going to speak in English because my Irish is really not up to talking about neutrality, but I wanted to give the introduction in Irish at the beginning. So I'll set out a few basic things about neutrality that are often missed when we have these discussions. Very, very rarely will you ever hear that neutrality is actually rooted in international law. And it's really important that we don't forget that, because the law is on our side in that respect. So neutrality is actually rooted in international law from the Hague Convention from 1907. And it sets out really clearly that if, a neutral state will have certain powers and also obligations at a time of war. And at one point in Ireland, there was a case in 2003. It was taken by Ed Horgan, and it was in relation to the US use of Shannon Airport in the context of the Iraq War. And they actually drew on international law in that case, and they showed very clearly that what Ireland was doing in terms of allowing the US to use Shannon Airport was in violation of international law. But Ed Horgan, for various reasons, he actually lost the case. But it was a really important aspect of that case that the courts actually did recognise that the way Ireland is applying its version of neutrality is not consistent or compliant with how neutrality is actually set out in international law. Also really important to recognise when Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, when she released her most recent report and she named Ireland as a country that's complicit in genocide. And the example that she gave there was the US military use of Shannon Airport. And we all know as well the Israeli overflights that have been using Irish airspace to traffic weapons or transit weapons to commit a genocide. So often when you talk about neutrality in an international sense, people think neutrality means doing nothing, whereas actually what the Irish government has been doing is, letting, if we were to be neutral and implement neutrality as it's set out in international law, we would stop US military use of Shannon Airport, and we wouldn't be complicit in genocide. So neutrality in international law is a really useful tool to not participate in war, but also to promote peace. And as Fionn mentioned, he gave various examples of the Irish media and how it's been talking about neutrality. You will very rarely, if ever, hear neutrality referenced in the media as a tool to promote peace, as a tool that's actually rooted in international law. You're told that it's kind of this irrational emotional attachment we have to this thing called neutrality that we kind of make up as we go along. So it's really important to set out, it's not an irrational emotional kind of attachment to this thing that nobody knows quite what it is. It's actually rooted in international law. In Ireland, for us, it's very much with an anti-imperialist stance. And I think Fionn mentioned Wolfe Tone, James Connolly. It's rooted in this idea that neither king nor Kaiser but Ireland, and that we will not be dragged into imperialist wars, and that neutrality is a tool that we will apply to keep us out of imperialist wars. Those two things are very often missed in the media discussion, in the political discussion that you hear on neutrality. Then there's also the business side of things. So war is big business. Rory mentioned Thales, Fionn mentioned a number of the figures that are being rolled out for military spending. I brought along one of the European Commission's most recent reports. It's the Rearm Europe plan for 2030. And the opening of it is basically it's 150 billion euros of loans. And they say, buy more, buy better, buy together, buy European. So this is the plan, and it's to spend, hundreds of billions of euros on militarizing any way and every way possible. And imagine the pressure coming on a neutral country, because we have a significant amount of money, hundreds of billions of euros that are going into the arms industry, public money that will be channeled into some of the most lucrative and corrupt companies on the planet. And so if you have this massive war agenda, coming from Brussels, also coming from London, and in the middle of that war agenda, you have a neutral country, it makes warmongers very uncomfortable, because it shows them that there is an alternative. We don't have to be spending all of these hundreds of billions of euros on militarizing. Look at that country over there. They're not doing that. It highlights how unnecessary and how corrupt and how damaging it is, this, the militarization of Europe and the war industry. So neutrality makes warmongers very uncomfortable. And that's why there's an attack on neutrality, not just in Ireland, but also Sweden and Finland have recently ditched their neutrality, and they're now front and center of the NATO alliance. Most recently, there were NATO military exercises taking place in Finland, less than 100 kilometers from the border with Russia. They were deploying B-52 bombers in the middle of God knows where in Finland, really out in a remote part of Finland, doing B-52 bomber exercises within 100 kilometers of the border with Russia. You have Sweden reintroducing conscription and preparing people for war. So neutrality is under attack. Now you have Switzerland, which is bringing about legislative change to also change their neutrality. So when we imagine the attack on Irish neutrality, we have to understand it within this much broader context where neutrality is under attack everywhere, and Ireland is part of this much broader attack. So neutrality makes warmongers very uncomfortable if we continue to be neutral, and also nobody gets rich from neutrality. All of the money that's being made in the war industry, nobody is getting rich from neutral Ireland that doesn't participate in the drawing down these European Union funds that are offering hundreds of billions for us to arm up. The university sector is, as Rory mentioned, Horizon Europe, the European Union funds are offering additional funding. If you have what they call defence and military dimension to the projects that you're setting out. So that's kind of the international scale of where neutrality is at and what we're up against. And then as we've been going around the country doing these road shows, often people will think neutrality is protected in the Irish Constitution, because we have such a sense that we're a neutral country, and that neutrality is so important to us as a part of our identity. And so then when you say actually neutrality is not protected in Bunreacht, people are often surprised and then kind of terrified. Okay, well then they can just get rid of it. So where is neutrality rooted? And so it is a policy that has been implemented for decades. And it is very much rooted in the idea of anti-imperialism. So, starting with the Wolfe Tones, moving on to the James Connolly and the Irish Neutrality League in that period. And then when, it's De Valera during World War II. I mean, if you have time, you can look up the exchanges that went on between De Valera, Britain and Washington at that time, and the pressure that Ireland was coming under, not from Nazi Germany to ditch our neutrality, but from the Brits and from the US, that Ireland would ditch its neutrality and join with the Allied forces, and De Valera held strong. There's one telegram that came from Churchill, and it's a nation once again, and they basically dangle, it's like the carrot and stick, they dangle the idea of a united Ireland if we will just get rid of our neutrality and participate in World War II. And it's a little bit like what Rory was setting out. It's a bit the same again, like the threat to Irish neutrality is not coming from Russia or from China. They don't care if we're neutral or not. It's not an issue from them. The threat to our neutrality and the pressure that's eroding it is coming from the Brits, is coming from Brussels, is coming from Washington. And that's very clearly laid out in, Rory didn't mention, I don't think you mentioned this, closing the back door. So when we were in Belfast before Christmas, I discussed this report quite a bit, but I'll just mention it quickly. So it's a report that was made by a think tank in London called Policy Exchange. I'm not sure if people have heard of it. It's called Closing the Back Door, Rediscovering Northern Ireland's Role in British National Security. Now, this is a horrific document, really, really horrific, one of the worst. But it's full of absolutely, outrageous language and quotes, and the way they speak about Ireland, that they basically set out a two-pronged strategy, that for the northern 6 counties that are still occupied, they will have to further militarise those, and they set out that they will have to militarise Derry Port, and also Aldergrove will have to pick up pace. And then they set out for the 26 counties that are currently not occupied, but the political pressure is coming in, that those 26 counties will have to come in under a British security banner. It's set out here like very clear strategy how that will operate. This is from 2024. Then you have in 2025 what Rory mentioned with the House of Lords. You have Rear Admiral Chris Parry going on Clare Byrne, as Rory said. He talks about the Brits needing to install a radar system in the west of Ireland. Now that's coming directly from this think tank and this report. So it's this idea that Irish neutrality is an inconvenience for Britain. It's putting them, we're exposing them. So we have to ditch our neutrality to protect Britain, basically. And then for the Europeans, it's the same thing, that we have to ditch our neutrality to protect the undersea cables, all of these kinds of things that are being rolled out. So in the middle of all of that, there's the triple lock, which we've mentioned a few times. The triple lock is a piece of legislation that governs the deployment of Irish troops overseas. So it sets out that for more than 12 troops to be sent abroad on an overseas mission, there must be approval from the Cabinet, there must be approval from Dáil Éireann, and the mission that those troops are being sent on must have a United Nations mandate. And that is the piece of legislation that is keeping Irish troops out of being deployed to Iraq, for example, or any, illegal war. Irish troops cannot, at this current moment, participate in illegal wars because they would not have a United Nations mandate. And that's hugely embarrassing for the government, because Irish troops have been participating in EU battle group training exercises. So we can participate in training exercises. We've been participating in NATO training exercises, which is, horrific. We shouldn't even be in the training exercises if we're a neutral country. But we've been participating in the training exercises, but we cannot deploy on full-scale missions while the triple lock is in place, because presumably a full-scale deployment of a European Union battle group would not have a United Nations mandate. So the government is really keen to get rid of the triple lock so that there's no impediment on sending Irish troops overseas. They spin around what the triple lock is incredible. So we've been told that the triple lock is an encroachment on Irish sovereignty from the United Nations, that the UN, I wrote down some of the quotes from Helen McEntee, the most recent quotes, but basically that we need to get rid of the triple lock to take back our sovereignty. Now, the triple lock simply commits Ireland to only deploying troops on a United Nations mandated mission. That's all it is. If we deploy on a mission that's not within the United Nations framework, then we are acting outside of international law. So this attack on the triple lock comes at a time when the United Nations is being undermined in every way, shape or form. And we've seen that with Gaza, where the UN has never come under such severe attack. I mean, there's been more UN staff killed in Gaza than in any other conflict at any time ever. And Irish troops coming under fire in Lebanon as they're part of a UN peacekeeping mission. But we're told the triple lock needs to go so we can take back our sovereignty. Then we're told that we need to remove the triple lock to deploy, this is a quote, to deploy our troops to parts of the world that need their expertise. Now, what does that mean? You know, what expertise are you talking about? What mandate do you have to go? And this is, again, probably connected to the fact that Irish troops have been training Ukrainian troops in Germany. So Irish troops have been deployed to Germany for the last 2 or so years to train Ukrainian troops under a European Union mandated mission. We can deploy because, again, it's framed as being a training mission. So we can train Ukrainian troops, and then they go back and they participate in a war with Russia. So it's very clear that the Irish government wants to ditch our neutrality. You know, they see it as being outdated, archaic. It's an embarrassment. You know, they want to kind of go off to Brussels and be part of the warmongering bubble. And neutrality is really making them look bad in front of their so-called, you know, like-minded partners and whatever. And so at the moment, the government is eroding. It's in the process of eroding the triple lock. Maybe I'll just say where that is at. So last year, they brought the legislation to do that to Cabinet in March. That's when we decided to hit the road. And it's not that we think the triple lock is the be-all and end-all. It really isn't. It's the most baseline. That all it does is restricts us from participating in illegal wars. We still have to deal with Shannon Airport being used. We still have to deal with the Israeli overflights and all of that. But the triple lock allows us an opportunity to mobilise around neutrality much more broadly. To keep the triple lock, but to also go much further, and that Ireland would that we would push towards having an Ireland, and this is in the context of this festival, and thinking about a new Ireland or an Éire Nua. There's kind of two ways that you can see things going, and one is kind of the way Rory set out with the Atlanticist stuff, and that this is already being talked about. Like, you have reports like this that are already talking about Ireland and what, you know, the powers that be in the Dáil and in Westminster want it to look like. And then there's what we as the people want a new Ireland to look like. And I think for us, going out and talking about neutrality, it's the idea that we need to have a 32-county Ireland that is neutral. I don't think any of us would celebrate if we had a 26-county Ireland that was entirely neutral and then we had 6 counties still under British occupation. We need the whole island to be a neutral 32-county Ireland. Because, at the beginning of the roadshow, people were a little bit surprised that we were coming to Belfast and to Derry, and we were in Fermanagh. Was it Fermanagh, wasn't it? Yeah. People are a bit surprised. Why are you going up there talking about neutrality? What's that about? And it's the idea, well, I mean, we have to, we can't sell it. We can't just focus on 26 counties and if we're coming at this from an anti-imperialist stance, it would be a huge blind spot if we were to ignore the fact that there's 6 counties still under British rule, and that if we want to really, push for a neutrality that is rooted in anti-imperialism, that is rooted in international law, that is a policy of the people, then we have to start with what we're dealing with, which is 26 counties, 6 counties, and how do we bring a neutrality movement together that deals with that reality and works from there. So, yeah, that's maybe all I'll say on neutrality. I don't know if that was in any way coherent or a bit all over the place. But yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that, and then hopefully we can get some comments. And I'm just thinking of the time, because we started a bit late. We were also told it's West Belfast time, so everything runs late. But yeah, we still have time for questions, I think. I mean, we should have finished half an hour ago. But we also started late. Any comments, questions?
Are you positive that you can retain the triple lock? And thinking that Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael are so positive, they're pushing us into the links with the European Army, etc. And the media is all lined up against the people. What is your sort of feeling? And is it likely to be held dear by the public down south? Because I think there's not enough left-wing sort of proponents, to help retain the triple lock. Just ask, are you optimistic or not?
No, I mean, they have the numbers. So if it just comes down to the way it's brought forward in the Dáil, Dáil vote, a Shannon vote, they have the numbers to push it through. I suppose what we've tried to focus on is organising very much on local level. So there's been a number of county councils that have voted around the country. We've had motions brought at county council level where councillors even from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have there been Fine Gael ones, I'm not sure, but Fianna Fáil councillors that have voted to keep the triple lock and have made, really good statements. And we're kind of hoping that within the parties that there would at least be a discussion from those. And some of those councils have written, they usually would then write to the government and say, we've approved this motion on keeping the triple lock. There was a motion approved in the Mid-Ulster District Council, and they wrote a fantastic letter to the government, which they published. And then the government actually replied, and I think they published the reply as well. But it's kind of building that pressure on the government so that, if the vote happened tomorrow and it's a numbers game, they have the numbers. But I suppose one of the things we were talking about was if we built enough pressure that they might just keep delaying it. Because this has been going on for the first mention of getting rid of the triple lock was in 2023. And now it's 2026. So it continues, it goes very slowly. It's ruining our lives. Almost trying to be responding to the triple lock.
Just get it over and done.
I know, just get it. Just either pass the thing
have our
or
weekends back.
bin it. So
A few runs to go.
But they do have the numbers. I think they will probably try to get rid of it before the European presidency. I would imagine they will move through very quickly if they, and then it'll go Dáil vote, Shannon vote, and then the president would have to sign it into law. There's a possibility that you could take a legal case. So for the Lisbon Treaty, the second time round, the referendum booklet that was sent to every household in the 26 counties, made a very clear reference to the triple lock and said if you vote yes in Lisbon, you are doing so on the basis of the triple lock being in place. So there's a potential there to take a case saying it's unconstitutional because we approved a referendum on the basis of the triple lock. So who knows if there's different angles in there. So it's the thing in the Shannon.
Yeah, there's a mechanism within the constitution where if the law gets passed, the Dáil majority passes it, then if you have the approval of the president, a majority in the Shannon and 1/3 of the Dáil, then it can be kicked back to the people for a national referendum. But, if they have the numbers in the Dáil, they have the numbers in the Shannon. It's very difficult to see how that could be pulled together.
There was another question there.
Yeah, thanks very much. I attended your talk there last before Christmas, and I'm a guy who lives I live in the East, alright, so I don't get over here enough. I've started actually Irish language classes over on the road there, but it was after the talk before Christmas that I lost a bit of faith in the United Ireland, and I just need to play devil's advocate and just to hear your opinion, because it was very oppressive, very scary information that we're given. And I just was led to think that the British ex-army person that you were talking about, Ireland have it in their blood to fight off. Is it a potential angle to have a civil war in order to have us fighting amongst ourselves, in order to generate the income to military companies? And I'm conscious as well that not just Derry and Aldergrove being enhanced, but other business, television and stuff like that, other kind of insidious businesses that are going to be, with maybe not employers' full understanding, but funding the war machine. And I just wanted to know, what's your opinion on the potential of just having, if there is a United Ireland, there's going to be such a revolt up in the north, and will that provoke conflict within Irish army.
Yeah, I mean,
Us fighting.
I don't think that's the plan. I don't think there's that kind of divide and rule plan around this. I don't think there's a likelihood of that. I think, and I also think a United Ireland doesn't necessarily have to lead to conflict, including here. I think there'll be people who'll be very upset about it here, but it's about designing a process where that can be done peacefully and bringing people along, and for people having capacity to be upset and express that without themselves, having a military or whatever you want to say attempt to stop that. There's nothing inherent. There's no playbook that says there has to be violence in that, and I don't think anyone wants there to be violence. And I certainly don't think there would be some sort of like conflict between like the Irish army and like who is that, and either the British or groups of people here. But I think there's great care needed in any unification process to avoid violence and do it peacefully, and but that's very possible. I think it's also very likely. I don't predict there being be very stupid if that kind of happen, and I don't think that really has a relationship to, for example, the things about investment in arms companies and so on. I was speaking at a thing in Dublin on Thursday night with a different organisation. One of the speakers, he was speaking via Zoom, was Richard Wolff. I don't know if people know Richard Wolff, the American economist. And one of the things he said, and I have to admit I hadn't really thought of this, which was embarrassing to myself. They said that European states, and also it was EU, also Britain, they're militarising not just to fight wars, potentially. They're not just militarising for this kind of Keynesian, like investing in growth. They're also arming themselves to the teeth because they see that their own populations are getting increasingly angry about the state of their lives. They're disinvesting and distrusting from the institutions. And he was saying, in the context of the United States where he lives, he says, you look at Minneapolis and the way in which, and we've seen this at Black Lives Matter and all sorts of phases before, this huge kind of influx of military gear, a lot of it ex-Iraq and Afghanistan, being brought into civilian police forces, National Guard and so on, kind of militarization of the domestic security apparatus and the intensification of that security apparatus at the same time since the kind of war on terror, right? And I was embarrassed because being from Belfast, I hadn't thought of this really already. And you're like, right, well, sure, you don't have to think about Minneapolis. We can also think of Belfast, right, where we are. And the fact that this militarization is not just about, well, I've certainly been thinking about it so much in sense of the risk of war. I'm not talking about the risk of civil war, but of state repression using military enhanced technologies and so on. So I think there's a serious risk of that. That's another problem with militarization. It's not, even when we're talking about militarization, we're talking about, say, the way in which the economy is shaped towards arms, the way in which political structures and international relations are shaped towards war fighting. But there's also this dimension of the militarization of society, the embedding of militarization and normalization of our lives, but also the capacity of the state massively increasing its capacity for violent repression. And I think that's a serious risk. Nothing to do with civil war between, unionists and nationalists here or anything like that. This will be the British state and the Irish state against their own people. We have the EU presidency coming up in the south, and part of a host of things that's being done for that is there'll be lots of scaremongering about Russian drones attacking us and so on. But the police powers and police technologies are being enhanced in the south, and we've a very, demilitarized police force in the south. But they're arming them more, giving them a greater use of pepper spray, making new codes of conduct, to basically tasers to increase the repressive capacity of the state. And we have a very different policing culture in the south from here,
There's the law in the books about now the police are going to have powers to just look at all your social media, all your conversations, encrypted or not. This is a law coming through the doors now. Oh, sorry.
So, I don't know if that answers your question.
First, I'm glad you mentioned that point about the state arming themselves. But I wanted to ask a different question about basically, do you think that Irish neutrality, because it's only really talked about in sort of military terms really, But do you not think that it's sort of inevitable that they're trying to do away with neutrality, given the massive, the high level of economic integration with the sort of Atlanticist project? Do you not think we should be pushing for sort of trade with like BRICS more, for example, or like customs neutrality or multipolarity, rather in a sort of economic sense as well? Because I just feel that the doing away with military neutrality is just really was inevitable, given the very Atlanticist leanings of the Free State government.
Yeah, I mean, you've already. I mean, if you look at, if you go back to the Colby stuff, the Elbridge Colby stuff I was talking about earlier, they're very clear. Like you see what's going on with like Venezuela and the way that the Don Roe doctrine and all this stuff. Like they're very clear. Have you read the strategy document, the defense one that came out a week ago or so? It's absolutely chilling and it's very, very blatant. But they clearly say that, if you look after, Europe has to look after Europe's sphere of interest, and America looks after its sphere of interest. But what America means by its sphere of interest is military bases in Greenland, control over the new sort of Monroe Doctrine revamped for Latin and the Caribbean and Central America. But a central part of that is just getting China out. Getting Russia out, getting these other economic competitors out of their kind of area for mining and exploitation. And Europe, according to the American plan, is our responsibility is to get China out, to get these other investors who are competitions with the Western controlled capitalist order out of Europe. And like this, you can already see the Commission being aggressive with China. Now this is a live argument in Europe. There's some countries who see the benefits, obviously, clearly. Ireland is one of them who's, you can see Micheál is over in China and, there is a very live debate about this and it's a fight. And we'll have to wait and see, do the Atlanticists win the fight or not, But your question is really pertinent to if we cut this off, we just further come in as we are going to be mined. We're already being exploited by America in loads of different ways. And we are going to become a kind of a further colonized, really, by America as a site of extraction. And the step towards that is stepping away from the BRICS and these kind of, cutting off ties and all. It's really, our lives are going to be so miserable here in Europe. It's already pretty bad. Like,
Come on.
I'm always, people get really upset when I talk.
Person here who's left the last time depressed.
But he's back!
Loved it. Say Damascus.
So what do we do then if it's the 4th June and you're almost saying it's inevitable, and even if the triple lock didn't go, although some things need to, it's like, they arm themselves against us, essentially. What's left to do? I mean, we're sitting in a small room with 20 people. How do we get your message out? Because it's very insightful and fantastic, such detail. And I can hear all this idea. How do we get that out? It's not my social media. You're not hearing anywhere.
We'll have it out today.
Even I think that I think too much. I think those kind of love them or loathe them, the Piers Morgan type podcast thing where you talk and you take them on head on. Is there scope for that kind of platform?
Yeah, I mean, the media is really against us. Like, we give a few examples of the headlines. We had a piece in the Irish Times in November, which we were absolutely shocked that we even managed to get a piece in the Irish Times, because they never want to publish anything that's pro-neutrality. But we got a piece in the Irish Times and it really rattled, they were really rattled, the pro-European kind of mouthpieces, like, Bridget Lafferty of the world, was really rattled by it. She put out a tweet something like, shame on the Irish Times. This is our paper. How did you manage to let these people in? This is our space. It's our paper. That article came out on a Saturday, And by Monday evening, Thomas Byrne, the Minister for State for European Affairs and Defence, he was tweeting about it, saying Europe is the greatest peace project in the history of the world. He regularly rolls out this quotation. But it's like, if we get into that space, we really rattle them, because they know that their arguments they're not based on anything. It falls apart, and I do think they are terrified of the people actually finding out, because they know that the people support neutrality. They know that the people are not on board. Like, if the government came out and said, look, we want to get rid of the triple lock, because instead of going, because there's veto over Irish sovereignty from the United Nations and all of the other concocted nonsense, they actually came out and said, we want to get rid of the triple lock because we want to send Irish troops on EU battle groups and NATO-led missions, there'd be absolute uproar. There'd be people on the streets protesting, but they won't do that. And so we have to go around and have these talks, and then it's up to everyone in the room. So we usually say at the Neutrality Roadshow talks, everyone in the room has to go and take something from the talk and do something with it. You can't just go home and kind of, I went to the talk today on this. Like, there's been lots of efforts to organise on local level, like I said, the council motions. I mean, I don't know that we'll manage to stop the triple lock. I don't know that we'll manage to stop that, but I do think, like, if you think of the only national general strike that we had in Ireland was around the idea of conscription in 1918. And I do think if it comes to it and Irish people are being sent off to fight in foreign wars, I do think people will mobilise. And, when that's your reality, when it's that stark, when people are actually being mobilised, drafted to be sent off to fight in foreign wars, I think and I do, like, I have a lot of faith in the Irish people. I have absolutely no faith in the government, but I have an awful lot of faith in people, because everywhere we've went on local radio stations, people don't want to get rid of neutrality.
But we see that we parallel in England. The people don't want the genocide to continue.
Yeah.
But they brought in, they changed the law overnight to come after us. So, I think Europeans hit the money when we said they're arming themselves against us. You can tell there's appetite for a national.
I would feel similar, that it's like I have a lot of faith in people. I do fear that things might have to get a little bit worse before there's a positive response. But I think, look, this stuff's really fucking awful, and we're just getting out all this awful stuff, and people are getting depressed by it, but they're back for more. And it's really bleak, but I think, and not just in some kind of trickster, like, let's just cheer ourselves up, but I think, like, let's think about this is not just against something. It's not just against repression, militarization. It's also for something, right? And I think thinking about this is what's at stake in this. It's not just misery and war and killing and so on. It's also the loss of international law, the loss of the United Nations as a place where, it's very, very flawed, but a place where there can be peaceful resolutions and collective organising to have shared challenges and problems. And what do we need for that? We need kind of a system of states that are independent and sovereign, and that is respected, and there's some basic minimum there. And I think that what Irish neutrality does for the state in the south is it commits that state to at least that, and it's about the only fucking good thing it's ever done is to do that, and it's respected around the world for it. And I think, we can zoom out again a little bit, or rather go deeper into that, and we have Robbie here. And often when I finish talks in this in other roadshows, and also our comrade Paddy Breslin always kind of ends in this, is a distinction or a question that Robbie and Bill end on the end of their book, is this the question again for Ireland, and also kind of the question around the world, is republic or empire, right? And I think that's a very abstract thing. Those terms are very charged in Ireland and in this place, but I think so we're not necessarily fronting with that, but it's getting to the point where what is it we're fighting for here? And it's not just against things, it's also for things, a better world being possible, which is one of mutuality and respect and so on. And I think that question about trade is really like getting to the core of it. There's also a material basis to this, trying to move away from a case of economic dependency on the United States, and certainly in the Irish case, trying to build better relationships with BRICS countries, with China. We saw Micheál Martin was the first European EU leader in China this year. She was sitting delighted with his hands across his chest. And we saw Keir Starmer this week. She was back on the. He's just there. They're all coming like, and he's like happy out, you know. But I think that we are seeing like a pivot in this, where despite the Britain and the EU under NATO saying, okay, we're going to like take the disciplining the United States has given, they're also like, we also fucking need to go and talk to China, and we're going to do that. And the Americans aren't happy with that. Obviously, it's exactly what they don't want, but they are doing it, right? So I think there's the sense of people being, even the Europeans, even those in NATO, even though they're following and doing what they're saying and taking the money from all the real public crises, social crises that we all live with, sucking it into arms, they're still thinking, okay, actually, we also need to pluralise this a bit, and we need to talk to China. So not to put faith in the government, but you know, we're even seeing that. So getting a bit lost there.
I think also it's like we're over 2 years into a genocide, and you know, we've all been out protesting and doing every single thing we think we possibly can do to stop the genocide. You know, like the hunger strikers, protests, boycott, occupying buildings, going onto the runway in Shannon Airport. And now we see like this formation of a board of peace, and like, you know, the occupation of Gaza will continue and intensify. And it's really hard to to see all of the mobilization that happened around Gaza continues to happen, and yet we are where we are. And it's, like, just on your question, like, it's hard to know what to do. Like, I'm sure everyone here wakes up in the morning going, how do we live in a world that has normalized genocide and is now continuing and has the audacity to call what's supposedly going to oversee, you know, the development of real estate in Gaza as, you know, the Board of Peace, and that Tony Blair would be, you know, like, you couldn't write it as a plot for, if you were to write it like a dystopian film, you couldn't come up with as good a plot as what is actually happening. And that's the strategy. It's like, you know, like 2 weeks ago we're like, okay, are they going to bomb the shit out of Caracas, and is that it? And now this morning I'm getting up looking at news going, have they, you know, blown up Tehran overnight? And maybe while we're sitting in this room they have. So it's maybe like what Rory was saying, does it need to get much worse before we collectively push back so it starts to get better? Like, I also wonder, where are the unions? Like, no general strike, because, you know, complicity in genocide is a significant violation under international law, and we've had no action that's been significant on any way, shape or form from the unions on the genocide. Italy, okay, there was a general strike in Italy, but like, where are the unions? There's been an awful lot of pressure on the unions that are involved in the air traffic controllers that literally oversee the flights through the Israeli flights. Where are the unions to back up the staff to not, you know, direct those flights through Irish airspace? And you know, sometimes when we talk about international law, we're told we're naive and, you know, it's been eroded and now it doesn't matter. But international law is on our side. So, you know, we're not going to resolve everything by just focusing on international law, but it's actually on our side, and we have won the legitimacy with international law. When you look at, you know, the fact that Israel is on trial for genocide, continues to commit genocide. But I think, even just rooting ourselves in that gives us legitimacy to do all of the other things, like the people going onto the runway in Shannon. They anchor their actions in international law. They're trying to stop a genocide. So, I don't know what to like.
Okay, balance. I'm gonna uplift.
Uplift.
Ruined Rory's positive.
It's remarkable that Fionn's going to do the positive part.
I mean, it's not from a position of strength that you do what they're doing. You know, that this is a desperate attempt to maintain hegemony among the Western kind of order. And, you know, these states in Europe and America arming themselves against their own people. That's because there's more people than there is of them, and they're outnumbered, they're scared, and they know that capitalism has nothing to offer their publics. You know, in these crises, these polycrises or whatever, everything expands where there is more want in every single sector of your life, and there's less time in your life to kind of like look after your life because you're struggling to survive. I mean, this is a situation where it has to come to, you know, to speak in a kind of a Marxist-Leninist kind of way, it has to come to a point, you know. And it is not a position of strength. We are many, they are few. And, you know, it could be an absolute fucking disaster the next 20, 30 years, but hopefully out of the end of that, we come back to something good, and then the world burns. Okay, thank you.